I want you to picture this. You come home from your Tuesday water aerobics class, and sitting on your own kitchen table, right where you usually put your keys, is a glossy brochure for a nursing home. Not assisted living, not a retirement community. A nursing home with a photo of a smiling woman in a wheelchair on the cover and a sticky note on top in your daughter's handwriting that says, "Mom, just take a look, no pressure." That's how mine started. I'm Eleanor. I'm 76 years old, and about 8 months ago, I found that brochure on my table, and 2 weeks after that, I left my own note on that same table and got on a plane to Manila, and I haven't spoken to my daughter directly since, though that's finally starting to change, and I'll get to that. If you want to hear how this whole thing played out, stick with me and go ahead and hit subscribe now, because I've got a lot more to tell you, and I don't want you missing where this ends up. Let me back up, because a brochure doesn't just appear on a kitchen table out of nowhere. There's always a whole slow build-up behind it that nobody talks about until it's already happened to them. I lived my whole adult life in a town outside Portland, Oregon. My husband Walter and I raised 2 kids there, our son Peter and our daughter Diane, in a house on a quiet street with a big maple tree in the front yard that Walter planted the year Peter was born, which meant by the time all this happened, that tree was older than most of the people who'd eventually try to convince me I couldn't take care of myself anymore. I taught elementary school for 31 years, mostly second grade, and Walter worked for the county doing land surveying. Steady, dependable work that let us pay off that house years before either of us turned 60. Walter died 5 years ago. Heart attack, in his sleep, no warning at all, which people always tell you is a mercy, and I understand why they say it, but there's no mercy in waking up next to someone who was there when you fell asleep and isn't there anymore. After Walter passed, I did what I think a lot of widows do without quite realizing they're doing it. I shrank my life down to fit the size of the loss. I kept the house running exactly the way it always had. I still made coffee in his favorite mug most mornings, just out of habit, even though I never drank from it, just filled it and let it sit there on the counter like some kind of small daily ritual I couldn't quite explain to anyone, including myself. My son Peter lives about 3 hours away in Seattle with his wife and their 2 boys, and he'd call every couple of weeks, warm enough, but distant in the way adult sons often are, respectful of my independence almost to a fault. Diane lived only 20 minutes away, and Diane became a very different kind of presence in my life after Walter died. One that started out as comfort and slowly, quietly, turned into something closer to supervision. It didn't happen all at once. Nothing like this ever does. First it was just extra phone calls, checking in, which felt lovely at first, felt like being cared for. Then it became stopping by unannounced, always with some small excuse, dropping off soup, picking up a package she claimed had been delivered to her address by mistake, even though we didn't share a mail carrier. Then I started noticing she'd linger a little too long by my medicine cabinet in the bathroom, or ask a few too many pointed questions about whether I'd remembered to pay the gas bill. Questions that had a certain edge to them, an edge that said she wasn't really asking, she was testing. The thing that really set it off, I think, was a fall I had about 1.5 years after Walter passed. I was out in the garden, pulling weeds along the back fence, and I lost my footing on a patch of wet grass and went down hard on my hip. Nothing broke, thank God, just a nasty bruise and a scare, but I couldn't quite get myself up right away, and I lay there in the grass for close to 15 minutes before I managed to roll onto my knees and pull myself up using the fence post. I told Diane about it that same week, because I didn't want her hearing it secondhand from a neighbor and feeling like I'd hidden something from her. That was, in hindsight, possibly the single most consequential piece of honesty in my entire life, because that fall became the story Diane told herself and eventually told everyone else about who I was becoming. Within a month, she'd started using phrases I didn't recognize as coming from her own vocabulary. Things like, aging in place isn't always realistic, and we need to be proactive, not reactive. phrases that sounded lifted directly from some pamphlet or seminar, and it turns out that's exactly what they were. Because I later found out she'd started attending a support group for what she called caregivers of aging parents. Even though at that point I wasn't anyone's care recipient, I was a 75-year-old woman who'd slipped in wet grass the same way anyone, at any age, occasionally slips in wet grass. I tried to push back gently at first. I'd tell her I was fine, that I still drove myself to my water aerobics class 3 times a week, that I still hosted book club at my house on the 3rd Thursday of every month, that I still balanced my own checkbook down to the penny, a fact I was frankly a little proud of given how many people my age had handed that job off to someone else years earlier. But every reassurance I offered got quietly filed away as more evidence of the problem. If I sounded calm, she'd tell Peter I was in denial. If I got frustrated and raised my voice even slightly, she'd tell him I was becoming difficult, which is a phrase I've come to understand over the last 8 months, is one of the most quietly devastating things one family member can say about another, because there's no way to defend yourself against it without seeming to prove it true. About 4 months after the fall, Diane started bringing brochures. The first one was for something called a life plan community, left casually on my counter with a note that said, "Just thought this looked nice, no pressure at all," which is a phrase I want you to notice, that people only ever use right before applying a great deal of pressure. I looked at it mostly out of politeness and set it aside. She brought another one 2 weeks later, then another. Each one a little more explicit than the last, moving steadily from independent living communities with photos of active seniors playing pickleball, down through assisted living with photos of smiling people at communal dinners, and finally that morning, 8 months ago, to the nursing home brochure sitting on my table with her sticky note on top, the woman in the wheelchair on the cover staring up at me like some kind of preview of a future Diane had already decided was mine. I want to tell you what that felt like, standing in my own kitchen, in the house Walter and I bought together in 1974, holding a brochure for a nursing home that my own daughter had left there like a hint she didn't have the courage to say out loud. It didn't feel like concern. It felt like a verdict. It felt like being told, without a single spoken word, that the woman who'd taught second grade for 3 decades, who'd raised 2 children, buried a husband, and kept her own household running through all of it, had been quietly reclassified, behind her own back, from a person into a problem. I called Diane that evening and asked her directly what the brochure meant. She got very careful, very measured, the way people get when they've rehearsed something. She said she just wanted me to have all the options in front of me, that she wasn't saying I needed to move anywhere right now, just that it was good to plan ahead. I asked her point blank whether she thought I couldn't take care of myself. There was a pause, longer than I liked, and then she said, "I think you're getting older, Mom, and I think it's smart to think about these things before there's an emergency, not after." I told her the emergency she seemed to be preparing for hadn't happened. She said, "That's exactly what makes it the right time to plan before something forces the decision." I didn't have a good response to that in the moment, and I think that's the exact tactic these conversations rely on. This airtight logic where any calm response proves you're fine, and any upset response proves you're not, and there's no door out of that room, no matter which way you turn. Over the following weeks, things escalated in small, grinding increments. Diane started showing up to my doctor's appointments uninvited, sitting in the waiting room and then following me into the exam room, asking my physician-pointed questions about my memory, my balance, my medication schedule, questions I hadn't authorized, and that made my doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Alvarez, who I'd been seeing for over a decade, visibly uncomfortable. Dr. Alvarez, to her enormous credit, told Diane directly in front of me that there was nothing in my chart suggesting any decline whatsoever, that a single fall in wet grass at 75 was not a diagnosis. It was an accident, the kind that happens to people of every age. Diane didn't seem to hear it, or maybe she heard it and simply filed it away the same way she filed away everything else that didn't fit the story she'd already written. Then came the part that really broke something open in me. I found out, entirely by accident, flipping through mail that had been left on my counter, that Diane had contacted an elder law attorney and that she and Peter, whom she'd apparently been quietly recruiting to her side of things over a series of calls I was never part of, had discussed the possibility of petitioning for a guardianship, not immediately, but as what she described in an email I wasn't meant to see, printed and left in a stack of papers she'd forgotten to take with her, as a contingency if Mom continues to resist reasonable planning. I sat at my own kitchen table and read that sentence 4 times before it fully landed, the word resist doing an enormous amount of quiet, ugly work in that sentence, turning my simple desire to keep living my own life into something that needed to be managed, contained, planned around. That's when I called Peter directly, the first time I'd initiated a call to him in months rather than the other way around. And I asked him straight out whether he was really considering something like guardianship for a mother who still drove herself to the grocery store, still hosted book club, still balanced her own checkbook. He was quieter, more hesitant than Diane, and I think, looking back, less genuinely convinced, more just worn down by his sister's persistence and his own guilt about living 3 hours away and not being around enough to form his own independent judgment. He said, "Mom, we're not trying to take anything from you. We just don't want to be caught off guard if something happens." I told him something already had happened, right there in my own kitchen, and it wasn't a fall in the garden. It was a family quietly deciding, behind my back, that my remaining years were a risk to be managed, rather than a life that still belonged to me. I didn't sleep much that week. I sat with Walter's old coffee mug in front of me most mornings, thinking about how furious he would have been watching this unfold, how he never once, in 48 years of marriage, treated me like something fragile that needed handling. And somewhere in the middle of one of those sleepless nights, I remembered something a friend from my book club, a woman named Ruth, had mentioned almost a year earlier, laughing about it at the time, how her cousin had retired somewhere in the Philippines, a place called Baguio, up in the mountains, cooler than most of the country, and how her cousin's photos looked like something out of a completely different, brighter life than the one most of us were quietly settling into back home. I started researching that same week, secretly, the way I imagine a lot of people research the thing they're not ready to admit they're actually considering. I looked into the Special Resident Retirees Visa, the long-term retirement visa program, and found that between my teacher's pension and Walter's life insurance, which Diane didn't have access to and, as it turned out, didn't even know the full amount of, I comfortably met the financial requirements. I read forum after forum written by retirees my age and older, some who'd been living there for over a decade, describing lives that sounded frankly fuller than the one I'd been quietly shrinking into back in Oregon. I watched hours of videos of small apartments and gardens and mountain towns and beach towns, and somewhere in that research, a plan that had started as pure fantasy started turning into something with actual edges and actual steps. I gave myself 5 weeks to put everything in order, working almost entirely alone, telling no one, not even Ruth at first, because I knew if word got back to Diane before I was ready, she would find a way to stop it, whether through legal maneuvering or through sheer emotional pressure, and I honestly wasn't certain, in my more anxious moments, which one I was more afraid of. I quietly consulted my own attorney, an old friend of Walter's named Harold, who'd handled our estate planning for years, and confirmed that nothing Diane and Peter had discussed had actually been filed, that no court had granted anyone any authority over my decisions, that as of that moment I remained, legally and in every other sense, an entirely capable adult, free to make her own choices, including the choice to leave the country. I sold my car privately to a young couple down the street, deposited the cash into an account only I had access to. I arranged for a property management company to look after the house, deciding, much like I imagine a lot of people in my position eventually decide, to rent rather than sell outright, partly for practical reasons and partly because some part of me wasn't ready to let go of the last physical thing Walter and I had built together with our own hands and our own money. I set up international health insurance specifically designed for retirees abroad, the kind that covers evacuation and major medical procedures, because I knew, with total certainty, that healthcare would be the very first argument thrown at me the moment any of this came out, and I wanted an answer ready before the question was even asked. I booked a one-way ticket to Manila for a Monday in early spring, and on the Sunday before I left, I did something I've thought about a great deal since, something I'm still not entirely sure was the kindest way to handle it, though I've made a fragile peace with it. I didn't call Diane. I didn't sit her down. I wrote a note, much the way she'd once left a note on top of that nursing home brochure, and I left it on the same kitchen table where hers had once sat. It said simply, "Diane, I've moved to the Philippines. I'm safe, I'm healthy, and I made this decision entirely on my own, with a sound mind and full knowledge of what I was doing. I love you. I'll call when I'm settled." And underneath that, I left the guardianship email she'd forgotten to take with her all those weeks earlier, the one with the word resist in it, folded neatly, so she'd understand exactly why I'd chosen to leave a note instead of having one more conversation I already knew, down to the last word, how she'd respond to. I flew out that Monday morning with one suitcase and a carry-on, no one at the airport to see me off, which felt lonelier in the planning than it actually did in the moment, because somewhere around the second hour of that 18-hour journey, layover included, I stopped feeling like a woman running away from something and started feeling, for the first time in nearly 2 years, like a woman finally moving toward something instead. I landed in Manila on a Tuesday evening, the heat and the noise and the sheer overwhelming aliveness of the airport hitting me all at once, and I'll admit I stood there for a full minute just letting it wash over me, 76 years old, completely alone in a country I'd never set foot in, and feeling, strangely, less afraid than I had in months sitting alone in my own kitchen back in Oregon. I'd arranged, through a relocation service that specializes in retirees, for a driver to take me directly to a hotel for the first 2 nights while I got my bearings, and the next morning I flew north to Baguio, the mountain city Ruth's cousin had once described, chosen specifically because I wanted the cooler climate, closer to what I'd grown up with in Oregon, and because something about the idea of pine trees and fog in the mornings felt like less of a leap than the tropical beach towns everyone else seemed drawn to. Baguio surprised me from the very first morning. It sits high enough in the mountains that the air actually has a chill to it in the early hours, and the city is full of pine trees and winding roads and a large public market that reminded me, oddly, of farmers' markets back home, except cheaper and louder and somehow warmer in spirit, even with the cooler air. I rented a small 2-bedroom house partway up a hillside with a little garden out front for around 14,000 pesos a month, somewhere around $250, a number that made me sit down heavily on my new couch the first time I did the math, because that was less than a third of what I used to spend on property taxes alone back in Oregon. My landlady, a woman named Marites, lived just below me on the same hillside with her husband and 3 grown children who still lived at home, which is apparently common there. Adult children staying close to their parents, not out of obligation, but out of what seemed like genuine, uncomplicated affection, a dynamic that struck me, more than almost anything else in those early weeks, as a quiet rebuke to everything that had just happened in my own family. Within my first week, Maritiz's youngest daughter, a young woman named Joy who worked at a local bakery, showed up at my door with a small box of ube pastries. "Just to welcome you, Ma'am Eleanor," she said, before hurrying off, embarrassed before I could even properly thank her. The early weeks were not easy, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretend I stepped off that plane into instant paradise. I didn't know how the local jeepneys worked. These brightly decorated open vehicles that seemed to follow routes only the locals understood by instinct. I got overcharged at the market during my first outing, buying strawberries, which Baguio is famous for, and it was an older woman running the next stall over, a stranger named Aling Baby, who pulled me aside afterward and told me, kindly but firmly, exactly what I should have paid, and from that day forward she made a point of waving me specifically toward her own stall whenever she spotted me coming, quoting me a fair price before I even had to ask. I found a small cafe near the market that quickly became my anchor point, a place run by a young couple, Mark and Cherry. And within 2 weeks, the barista, Cherry herself, had my order memorized: a black coffee and a small ensaimada, a sweet bread I'd never heard of before landing there, and now genuinely craved. Mark, who'd spent a few years working in a hotel in Dubai before coming home to open the cafe with his wife, spoke excellent English and started sitting with me some afternoons when the cafe slowed down, and one day, several weeks in, he asked me, with the kind of directness that seems to come more naturally there than it ever did back home, why an old woman like me had traveled so far alone. I told him the whole story, the fall in the garden, the growing pile of brochures, the guardianship email, all of it, and he listened without interrupting, and at the end he simply said, "Here, if our mother fell in the garden, we would just plant softer grass." It's a small joke, I know, but something about the plain, uncomplicated logic of it has stayed with me ever since, the way it exposed, without meaning to, just how strange and how far my own family had drifted from something that basic. I found my way, almost by accident, into a small community of other retirees, mostly through Mark's Cafe, which apparently doubled as something of an informal gathering spot for foreigners who'd settled in the area. I met a woman named Carol, originally from Minnesota, 79 years old, who'd moved to Baguio 9 years earlier after her own divorce left her, in her words, with a pension and absolutely no reason left to stay in a state that cold. I met a retired schoolteacher like myself, a man named Frank from somewhere outside Chicago, who'd been there almost 7 years, and a younger couple, still working remotely, who'd moved for the cost of living and stayed for what they described as a slower, kinder pace of life than anything they'd known back home. Carol, in particular, became something close to a lifeline in those first months. She understood the specific loneliness of losing a spouse and rebuilding an entire life from nothing at an age when most people expect you to be winding one down rather than starting over, and we began meeting most mornings at Mark's Cafe, comparing notes, trading small local knowledge, which market stalls to trust, which pharmacy had the friendliest staff, which tricycle drivers would give you a fair price without haggling. About 10 weeks into my new life, I had what I can only describe as my genuine test of everything I'd chosen. I woke one night with a sharp, persistent pain in my lower back that wouldn't ease no matter how I shifted position. And lying there alone in a rented house on a hillside in a country where I still didn't fully know my way around, I felt, for one long, cold moment, exactly the kind of fear Diane had spent nearly 2 years insisting I should be feeling constantly. I called Carol, whose number I'd saved specifically for a moment like this one, and she was at my door within 20 minutes, driving me herself to Baguio General Hospital. I'm 76 years old, and nobody here is quietly building a file on me. Nobody is deciding behind my back how much risk I'm still allowed to take with whatever years I've got left. I get up most mornings to the sound of roosters and the smell of Mariti's cooking drifting up the hillside, and I walk down to Mark's Cafe for coffee and an ensaimada, and I think, most days now without any bitterness left in it at all, about how a brochure meant to shrink my life into something smaller and safer ended up being the exact thing that finally set it loose. If any part of this sounded familiar, if you've got someone in your life who started treating your independence like a problem to be managed instead of a life still worth living, I hope this gave you something worth holding on to. And if you want more stories like this one, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because there are plenty more where this came from, and I think you'll want to hear them. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.